Hi, my name's Stuart Lynch, and this is the first video in a series of videos where I'm going to be building an app using SwiftData. In this first set of 3 videos, we'll be looking at creating an application for tracking books that you've either put on your shelf, you're in the process of reading, or you have read. Now this is going to be the longest video in this series, and I'm going to introduce you to the CRUD operations for creating, reading, updating, and deleting records, and persisting them to a SQLite database in your device. In the sections that follow this video, we'll build on this application, and I'll introduce you to relationships such as one-to-many and many-to-many relationships. We'll even take a look at localization and CloudKit. So I hope you stick with me as we explore this exciting new framework. I love getting your feedback, so tap the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this video and leave a comment below. Make sure you subscribe to the video and ring that bell to get notifications of new videos. And if you want to support my work, you can buy me a coffee. So we want to create an iPhone application that's going to allow us to add and track books that we have obtained and are either waiting to read, in progress, or completed. And we might want to add a summary about a book or even give it a rating. So let's create a new app now in Xcode, and I'm going to call it My Books. Now we could choose SwiftData as the storage option, but that would create a lot of boilerplate code that we would have to change. And besides, with SwiftData, it's really easy to create our persistent models and storage manually. Let's start then by creating a model for our book. When I create a new entry, all I'm going to want to do is add a title and an author. So we'll be setting some default values for the other properties, but I'll get to that. So first let's create a Swift file called book. Inside there, we'll create a class called book, and let's add some properties. We'll need a title and an author, and both of those are strings. I want to track when I add the book, when I started the book, and when I finished it. And these will all be date properties. And you might think that I should be making the started and completed versions of these properties optional. But I find that because I'm going to be using a picker, it's easier to set a default value that you will see shortly. For the summary, I'll create a string property. And for the rating, I will create this as an optional int. Now, in order to track the status of our book, I'm going to create an enum for that property, and I'm going to call it status. I'll just create it here in the same file. I'm going to make it of type int, but for SwiftData, we'll need to make sure that it's codable. And I'm also going to want to use it in a picker. So I'll need it to be identifiable, and if I use case iterable, I can loop through all the different cases. Well, the 3 cases that I want are on shelf, in progress, and completed. To satisfy the identifiable protocol, I can create a computed ID property that is of type capital S self and simply return self. Now the picker is going to need some text to display for each case, so I'm going to create another computed property that I'll call descript, or DESCR, and that's going to be a string, and I'll switch on self. And then for each case, I can return the text representations of these cases. So on shelf, in progress, or completed. So now I can add a status property to our class that will be of this type status. Next, since I'm using a class here, I'll need an initializer. Now let me select the parameters of our initializer and use that Control-M shortcut introduced in Xcode 15 to separate them out onto multiple lines. Now as I mentioned, the only things I'm going to require is the user to enter the title of the book and the author. So that means I'm going to need to supply default values for every other property. The date added will be assigned the current date, or date.now. And then again, instead of making the date started and date completed optional and having to check for that, I'm going to use the static date.distantPastDate when we have not yet started or completed a book. For the summary, I'll just use an empty string, and that rating defaults to nil. And for status, when the book gets added, I will put it on shelf. Well, the only thing that is necessary now for our model to make it into a SwiftData object is to import SwiftData and then decorate our class with a @model macro. So in creating a new book, all we'll need to do is ask for the name and author and set the default values for every other property. Well, now that we have our model, we'll need to, when the app starts, create the container for it so that it can persist the data. And with SwiftData, this is extremely easy. When our app launches, we can apply a SwiftData method to our window group. So I'm going to import SwiftData here. And we have now access to a model container method. And the only requirement is for us to specify the persistent model type that we want to store. And for us, that model is our book, and we'll have to go .self. I always like to check out that backend data where it's stored, and I've discovered that, like core data, it stores it by default in the application support directory for our app in the simulator. So I'm going to create an initializer for when our app gets created, and then I'm going to print out the path to this location. And since application support directory in Finder is more than one word, I'm going to remove the %20s that the path will generate for each space by setting the % encoded to false. So let me run this app now and reveal the console once it is launched. And I see the path is printed to the console. So let me select the path right now and right-click on it and choose from the Services menu, Open to open location and reveal the 3 files, just like core data. The first file is the default.store, and this is a SQLite file that I want to inspect with a SQLite editor. And you can use any editor of your choice, but I found that there's this free one that you might want to use to get started. I'll leave a link in the description. This is called DBBrowser. Now I've already downloaded and installed the Silicon Mac version for my M2 Mac Mini that I'm recording on. So if I right-click now on this file and open it in the application with that file, you'll notice that like core data, there are a lot of support tables in this database, but there is one for our book model. And don't worry about that Z or Z in front. This is a core data SwiftData thing. Now if you choose Browse Data, and then choose the table that we want to view the records on, which is our book table, you see that there are a number of columns, and specifically there are ones for all of our properties. Now we haven't created any books yet, but we'll come back to this once we do. The first letter in the CRUD acronym is C, and it stands for create. So let's see how we can create new books and have them stored in our database. So I'm going to rename this content view to Book List View. I'm going to embed that content currently in a navigation stack, and I'm going to add a navigation title using the string My Books. Now I'm going to follow this by setting up a toolbar, and I'm only going to have a single button on my toolbar. So within that toolbar, I can create a button, leaving the action out for now. But for the label, I'm going to create an image using the system name plus.circle.fill. Then I can set the image scale to large. I want to be able to present a bottom sheet that will ask for the book name and author. So I'm going to create a new file that I'm going to call New Book View, and it's a SwiftUI view. I'll add 2 state properties, one for the title and one for the author, and default both of them to empty strings. Well, I'm going to be presenting this as a modal sheet, so in order to dismiss it, I can add an environment variable for the dismiss key value and create it as dismiss. So So let's build the view now by replacing the body content with a navigation stack. And inside that navigation stack, we'll create a form. Within that form, I'm going to create two text fields. The first will be a text field using the string book title bound to our title state property. And I'll do the same thing for the second one, which is going to be our author, bound to the author state property. I'm going to add another button below this with a label create. And for the action, right now, I'm just going to call dismiss. But I'm going to set the frame so that it aligns with the trailing edge. And I can do that by specifying the max width to be infinity with an alignment at the trailing edge. And then to make it stand out, I'll make the button style bordered prominent. And I'll add a little vertical padding. Now, I also don't want the user to be able to tap on the button unless they've entered both a title and an author. So I can make it disabled if either the title is empty or the author is empty. And then I can add a navigation title using the string new book. And I'll set the title display mode to inline. Now, SwiftData stores all of the data in memory, and the information is not persisted to the database until necessary, for example, on creation, updates, or deletes. And these operations are all managed by the container's main context. So when we created our container, it creates that context and places it in the environment where I can access it with the model context key path. So let me create a variable called context from that environment key path right now. So to create a new book in our create action, we can create that book passing in the title and the author from our state text fields. And then I can simply call the contexts insert method passing in that book. And then, of course, we'll dismiss. So let's return now to book list view. And here we'll need to present a sheet when we tap the toolbar button. So let's create a state Boolean property that I'll call create new book, and I'll initialize it as false. After the toolbar, I'm going to create a sheet that binds is presented to that new create new book state property. And I'm going to use trailing closure syntax here. So I'm going to clean it up a bit. And then I'll display the new book view as the content. And I don't need it to be full screen, so I'll set the presentation detent to be just medium within that detent array. So to present the view, we'll need to set the create new book to true in our toolbar buttons action. So let me run in the simulator now and create a new book. You'll need to provide a name and an author. And you can create an entry for a real book or make one up like I'm doing here. So let's stop the app now and open our SQL editor once again to see what we have. I'll navigate to the Browse Data tab and select our book table. Notice the value has been entered for all but rating, and it's set at null because it was optional. It may look like summary doesn't have anything, but it is an empty string. Now, just so we have something to work with in our next section, create another couple of book entries in the app. Now, there's one more thing that I want to do, and that is in my new book view. I'd like to add a cancel button to dismiss the view if we don't want to create a new book when we presented that sheet. So I'll need a toolbar, and this button I want to be on the leading edge, so I will need to create a toolbar item and set the placement to top bar leading. And within there I can simply create a button with the label cancel And then for the action, I'll simply call that dismiss function. Now that we've created some entries, we'll need to be able to display them. And this is the R for read in the CRUD acronym. We're going to present these items in a list. Now, by default, arrays of the persistent model objects conform to the identifiable protocol. Each record in the book table has a unique object ID that we'll be looking at a little later. First, we'll need to be able to access all of the records, and this is done using a new query macro that is part of SwiftData, and it observes changes and refreshes the view anytime new changes occur. So, first we'll need to import SwiftData. We can then apply the macro that can accept a sort order and a filter option. Well, we're going to leave filter out for now, and I'll retrieve all of our objects, but I'm going to set a sort order, which is ascending by default, and I'm going to specify that property that we want to sort by using a key path. Later on, we'll be looking at sorting on multiple properties using an array of sort descriptors, but for now, we'll just use the key path, and we'll assign this to a private variable called books. And books will be an array of book. Well, now we can replace our VStack with a list, but we want to be able to use an onDelete function on our list items, so we'll need to use a for each loop within the list. In that list, I want to create a navigation link that will take me to a detail screen eventually where I can view and or edit the remaining properties. But for the time being, let's just have a navigation link that'll take me to a text view that'll display the book title. And for the label, I'm going to want to display the title and author, but also an icon representing the book status, and if there is a rating, a number of stars representing that rating. Let's also set the list style to a plain list. Now, if we want to be able to use the preview, we'll need to add the model container to our book list view here in the preview. But we don't want to persist the data in our preview. We just want to keep it in memory and not persist it. We could, but this becomes a bit problematic later on. In testing, we start the same way as we did in our @main section, but this time we'll add an additional argument that is in memory and set it to true. The default is false, which we had. So I'm going to return to our book model, and I'm going to create a computed property to represent a different icon for our book status. Computed properties aren't stored in the database, so our SQLite structure won't change. We can create this variable, and I'm going to call it icon, and it's going to be an image. Now, image is only available in SwiftUI, so I'll need to import SwiftUI instead of Foundation. Now we can switch on that status and create some appropriate images. So these are the ones that I'm going to use. For on shelf, it's going to be an image using the system name checkmark.diamond.fill. For in progress, I'll just use book.fill. And then for completed, I'll use books.vertical.fill. So let's return to our book list view now then and create the label for our navigation link. I'll start with an H stack with a spacing of 10. And then the first element in that H stack is going to be that book icon image. To the right of that, I'll follow it with a V stack with an alignment leading. And the first row will be a text field displaying the title. Then I'll set the font to a Title II font. Below that, the next row will be another text field, but this time displaying the book author. And I'll change the foreground style to secondary. And then because not all books have a rating, I can use an if-let to unwrap the book rating. And then if it exists, I can then create another H stack that will loop through from 0 up to the rating itself and set the ID as self. And then within the loop, I can create an image using the system image, which is a star.fill. I'll set the image scale to small and then change the foreground style to yellow. Let me run this now on our simulator and see what happens. We get to see all three of those books we created. None of them have any ratings though, and all the icons are for the status on shelf because that was the default when we created these. So let's stop the app. And I'm going to open the database in my SQL editor, and I want to edit some of the properties. So if I go to Browse Data for our Books table, I can, for example, update two of our statuses. For the status of 2, which is complete, I'm going to give it a rating of 4. Let me close the database and run again. We can see our updates have been applied. We have different icons for the status, and I can see a rating. Well, we can test in the preview as well. In the preview, I can create a new item. However, if I were to update my code or go to selectable on the preview and then back again, that item disappears because we're not persisting the data. Now, when there are no books in the list, we should be letting our users know to create their first book. And this is a perfect case for the content unavailable view. So let me just collapse this list here so that I can see things better. And then let me create an if check to see if the books array is empty. If it is, I'll display a content unavailable view using the text enter your first book. And then I'll use the system image of a book.fill. If it's not empty, we'll create an else clause and display that list. Now the problem is we have a title and a toolbar that I want to appear regardless, but we can't attach that to an if-else clause. So I'll need to enclose this entire if-else clause in a group so that our toolbar and our title can get applied. Now I've created an entire video on this new content unavailable view, so if you want to learn how to really maximize this view, I'll leave a link in the description. Give it a watch. In our preview then, we see that the content unavailable view, but when we create our first book, it disappears and is replaced by the list. We've done create and read from our CRUD acronym. We still have two more to do, update and delete. Well, delete's the easiest one, so let's do that right now. Since we use a for each loop, we can use an onDelete function that will give us access to the index set that we swiped on. And then we can step through each of our indices using a for each loop on each one to get an index of our books array that we're deleting. So then we'll let book equal books at that index. And just like when we added a book, we needed access to the context to insert it. So similarly, we're going to need to have access to that context to delete it. So again, we'll need to add an environment property with the key path model context, and I'll assign it to a variable called context. And now we can use that context to delete our book. Well, we can test this in the preview canvas by first adding a new book. And again, when we did this, the content unavailable view disappeared and the book appears in the list. But now we have a swipe action from the right that allows us to delete. And when that's gone, the content unavailable view appears again. So let's test on the simulator and take a look at our persisted data in our simulator. Let's delete this fictional book here. Let me double check then by going back into our SQL database in our SQL editor. If I navigate to the Browse Data tab for our book table, it reveals that we now only have 2 entries, whereas before I had 3. Everything's looking good so far. So we've got our last item in the CRUD acronym now, which is update. So we'll be able to update all fields in our book model. And for this, I'll need to create a new view. So let's create a SwiftUI view that we'll call Edit Book View. Well, this view is going to be displayed when we tap on our row, which is our navigation link from the list view. So we'll need to receive a book that it was tapped on. So I'm going to create a constant for that, a book, which is of type book. When we do this, however, the preview requires a book to be injected into the environment, but it has no idea what the container is and where to get this book, and the preview fails to load. So for the time being, I'm going to just comment out this book and build my UI, then test on a device to show it working. In the next video of this series, I'll show you how you can resolve this problem by creating an in-memory container with some sample data. Now the view is going to update every property, and rather than binding the properties to every property in the book to some text fields, pickers, and text editors, I'd rather create a corresponding state property for each of those properties. And the reason I'm doing that is if I use the book as a bindable object rather than a constant, I could bind each of the properties directly to the book itself. However, the problem would be that once I made a change, core data is going to automatically update and save those changes. And I might not want to do that. I want to give the user a chance to only update if there are changes. So rather than using a form though, I'm going to use a lot of labeled content views, as it's going to give me more control in my layout. So first, let's create a state property for each of the different 8 book properties that we want to update, and assign default values for all non-optional values. When we load this view, we'll assign the values of the book being passed in an onAppear method, so it's going to replace those values. Now the dates are not optional, but since they're going to be replaced by the book versions, we can simply use a date.distantPast in all cases. So I've created a state private property for each one of our different properties in our model. And for all except rating, I've created a default value. So let's replace the body content here with an H stack. And then as the first view, I'm going to create a text view using the string status. Next, we'll create a picker with the label status, where the selection is bound to the status state variable. Now we made the status case iterable, so we can use a for each loop to loop through the status's all cases to get a status iterator that we can use in creating the text view to display the status descript property. And then though we're going to have to set the tag to the status itself so that it'll update that status state variable once it's selected. And then I'm going to set the button style to bordered. Makes it stand out better for me. Below the H stack, I'm going to display all of our remaining 7 properties. So I'm going to create a V stack with the alignment set to leading. First, I'm going to display all of my dates, but only the relevant ones. So if the status is on shelf, I'm only going to display the date added. If it's in progress, I'll show the date added and date started. And if it's date completed, I'll show all 3. And I want those to all be included within a group box to stand out. Well, we can use labeled content here with the content and label constructor. So for the first one, the content will be the date picker, where the title key will be an empty string, with the selection being bound to the date added property. And I'm going to set the display components to only display the date. I don't care about the time. And then for the label, I'll use a text view with the labels date added. So we're always going to show the date added because by default, we always create the current date when the new book is entered. For the date started, however, we'll need to check to see if the status is either in progress or completed. If it is, we can use another labeled content where the content will be another date picker with an empty title key, this time bound to date started. again using the display components of date. For date completed, we'll first check to see if the status is completed. And if it is, we'll create another labeled content displaying the date completed. And let's apply a foreground style of secondary to the entire group. When we change the status, we'll want to possibly reset the dates, because if we go from in progress to on shelf again, we'll need to reset the in progress date. So let's look at all cases in an onChange modifier for this. Using the onChange of status, we get access to both the old and the new values. So if the new value is equal to on shelf, we'll set the date started to the date.distantPast, date completed to date.distantPast. Else if new value is in progress and old value is equal to completed, this means we've gone from completed to in progress backwards, we'll set date completed to date.distantPast. Another case, else if the new value is equal to in progress and the old value is equal to on shelf, it means we've started the book. So we can set our date started to date.now. The next case is if the new value is equal to completed, but the old value is on shelf, meaning we forgot to actually set the start book and jump from on shelf to completed. So we can set the date completed to date.now, but we'll set the date started to the same date that we added it. Else, our final case, when it's completed, we'll set the date completed to date.now. Below this, I'm going to create a divider. For the rating, I want to use a custom rating view that I created. And it's a modification of a ratings view that I show you how to design in a tutorial on using Swift packages. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to check that out. I've changed it a bit though, so I can't use this package, but you can access the code from this gist. And a link is in the description. You can either create a new file called ratingsview in your project and copy this code, or you can simply download the file here, unzip it, and drag it into your project. Now it's quite simple, and you can see from the preview that you pass in a max rating along with the current rating, which will be a binding to some value, which in our case is our rating state property, a width property, a color, and an SF symbol that has 3 different symbol variants, a regular, a fill, and a slash. The preview you see is using a red heart symbol with a maximum of 5 ratings and a width of 30. You'll see from the initializer, though, that the default width is 20. The color is a system yellow, and I use a star SF symbol. So this almost matches what I want. The only thing I'm going to want to change from the defaults is the width. In our Edit Book view then, below the divider, I'll create another labeled Content view. And for the content, I'll create a new Ratings view. I'll specify the max rating to be 5, and I'll bind the current rating to our rating property, but I'll set the width to 30. And then for the label, I'll just use a text view using the string rating. Moving on then, for the title of our book, I'm going to use labeled content again, where the content is a text field with an empty string for the title key, and it's bound to the corresponding state property. The label will simply be a text view showing title, and I'll set the foreground style to secondary. I'm going to duplicate this for author, as it's going to be very similar, but the text field will be bound to the author state property, and the text view will specify author instead. And then let me add one more divider, followed by a text view that displays the string summary with a foreground style of secondary. And then finally, below the text editor, where the text is bound to our summary variable, I'm going to add some padding of 5. And then I'm going to add an overlay of a rounded rectangle with a corner radius of 20. And then I'm going to set the stroke to a color that uses a UI color of a tertiary system fill and a line width of 2. Well, let me clean this up a little bit then. I'm going to add some padding and set the text field style to rounded border. And since this will be pushed onto a navigation stack, we can specify a navigation title that'll display the book title. And then I'm going to set the navigation bar title display mode to inline. So I'm going to create a toolbar now then that has a button with the label update, and leave the action for now, but set the button style to bordered prominent. Now you won't see this in the view because our preview has no idea that they're in a navigation stack. So to see it, let's embed the preview in a navigation stack. Well, once we've completed the update, we'll want to dismiss the view. So we'll need an environment variable for that using the dismiss key path. So then once we've updated, we can dismiss the view. Well, that's pretty much our design now. What we'd like to do is display the button if there are any changes to the book that we passed in. So let's uncomment the book and comment out our preview. That'll not work until the next lesson, and see what we have to do to update the book. When the book appears, we want to set the state properties to those that it gets from our passed in book, as I mentioned. So let's do that for each one of the state variables, matching the model properties with the corresponding book property. Status to book status, rating to book rating, and so on. Now, I only want to display that update button, though, if any one of those properties has changed. So I'm going to create a Boolean computed property that I'm going to call changed. And it's going to check for changes on any one of those properties. So let me just copy what was in that onAppear block and paste it in here and use some editing techniques. I want to check if status is not equal to book status, or the same thing will apply to each of the other properties. So let me do some multiple cursor editing here by doing a Control-Shift-Click and dragging down so that I can simply add the or and a space in front of each one of our other lines. And then I can Control-Click and similarly change equal to not equal. And then I can go back and only display that toolbar button if changed is true. Now there's one problem with our dates, however, though, is that setting them in our onAppear messes up the change computed property because of our onChange method. So to fix this, I'm going to introduce a Boolean property called firstView, and I'm going to set it to true because I only want this to set the properties in the onAppear when the view first appears and not after each refresh. So then all I'll have to do now is then change all of our assignments or our changes in the onChange with an if not first view clause. And then after the dates are established, set it to false. Then we can return to our toolbar for the action. If changed is true, before dismissing, we can apply all of these state properties to the book, and SwiftData will take care of changing and persisting those values. Finally then, back in our book list view, where we get that navigation link to the book title, we can change it to present the edit book view, passing in the book. Well, this is future me here, coming back to you with a slight update. I noticed that when I created the video that I had an issue when I was editing and changing dates. I want to make sure that the date added, started, and completed dates are sequential, and that I can't set a date out of sequence. For example, I can't set the date to a time before I started. So let me go back to the group box here, and where I set that date started, I'm going to specify that we cannot set a date before the date added. And we do that by specifying a range using in, and then we can say date added ... Similarly, for the date completed, we'll need to set the range starting from date started. So let's test this now by running on the simulator and see if our data persists. Let me create a book entry to make sure that it's not broken. Remember, all I need is a title and an author. Great, that works. So let's edit this book. Let's say I forgot to add this book when I got it, so I'm going to change the date to sometime last month. I've started reading the book, so let me change the status. And notice that when I do that, the date gets set to today's date. Let me give the book a rating so far. And how about a preliminary set of thoughts for my summary? This can be edited at any time. If I return to the list view, I see that my icon has changed and my star ratings are changed, but I think I only have it 3 stars, so I must have a mistake somewhere. Let me stop the simulator and see where my error is. That rating should be from 1, not 0. So let me run again, and you see that the data has persisted, and indeed the rating is correct. In fact, I really like this book, so let me change it to a 5. Well, that completes the basic CRUD operations, and subsequent videos in this series will not be as long and will focus on single topics. In the next video, we'll be looking more closely at how our model container is constructed and how we can have some control over it. And we'll also be fixing the issue that we have in the edit view where we can't preview the book in our preview. So in doing so, I will also show you how you can create and use some mock data so that you don't always have to be running in the simulator.